Forward onto the. Great. Hi, Judy. How are you doing? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you. Have you got snow at the moment?
Oh, we just had 12 inches yesterday.
Really, it's so weird because it's like 92 degrees here today.
Well, thankfully, and no tornadoes in your state. Oh.
Yeah, I was actually oh, hang on, there's people in the waiting room. Let me just let them in. I was actually playing this weekend at the Mid-South Flute Festival. I had a concert there yesterday, so I had driven up to Memphis on Friday morning to do the rehearsal that afternoon. So I kind of missed all the tornadoes, but I think, you know, Mississippi, which I drove through, and then Alabama, where I am today, badly. So I kind of left at the right time. Although the city that I'm in, there doesn't be any sign of anything. So nice to see you all here. How do I put this? So you think I would know how to work Zoom after all these years? There we go. I'm trying to put things onto gallery. So this is another Flute World class. Thank you to Flute World for hosting these. It's always very exciting. I get to do one a month. And the great thing about these classes is I can do them on whatever I choose. They don't tell me I have to follow certain guidelines. They just let me come up with a subject and then we go. So today's is all about French repertoire because I am very into French repertoire, as I think probably every flute player on the planet is, partly because of where I'm from, because as you can tell by my funny accent, I am not from the US. Or anywhere near North America. I'm from Scotland originally, and I spent a lot of my working life, in fact, all my working life pretty much in England, in London, and another city called Manchester. But every single teacher I ever had, and there was quite a lot of them over the years, for some reason studied in Paris, every single one, partly because of geographical location, but also partly because I kind of sought out the teachers I wanted to study with. And it took me quite a long time to realize that I was kind of picking teachers who shared certain qualities, you know, certain styles of playing. Hi, Jill, how are you? Nice to see you. I just see you sitting under the Northern Lights there. And all of these teachers, I didn't pick them because they studied in France. I picked them because I wanted to study with them. People like David Nicholson, he for many years was the first flute in the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and he was like the flute teacher in Scotland when I was growing up. So when I was 18 and I went to college, I wanted to study with him. He had studied in Paris with Rampal and Marcel Moïse. And I remember in my very first lesson with him, as this terrified 18-year-old, I didn't really know what I was going to play. So I came with a Mozart concerto, and I think the Gobert Fantasy, if I remember right. I don't know why I chose the Gobert Fantasy. It just was coincidental, nothing to do with the fact that it was French. Anyway, I went to my first lesson, and the first thing he said to me was, "Hey, Stephen, play me this sonority exercise from Marcel Moïse. You know, the semitone one that everybody plays." So like this 18-year-old kid, I went, and worked my way down. And he let me play for a minute or two, and then he went, "You know, when I played this to Moïse, blah, 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 blah." I don't remember what you said. I was like, "You what?" Like, that was my first kind of hearing anyone talk about him as a real person and not just this kind of mystical flute god. So this was a real moment, and I realized I was onto something good at this point. And David constantly spoke about Rampal and Marcel Moïse and all his experiences in France. Now, before David had gone to study in France, he had studied at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama with a guy called Geoffrey Gilbert. Now, Geoffrey Gilbert was very important. This is all important information about, I'm getting to a point, by the way, I'm not just telling random stories, but Geoffrey Gilbert was a very important person. And it's worth reading about this, especially if you're British or American or from North America somewhere, because at the time, flute playing was very different to what it is now. In fact, I would love to show you a video, and I might do it if we have time at the end. In fact, none of the performers have so far logged in, so we may have lots of time, in which case I will show you all this. But there's some amazing videos online of the British orchestras in the 40s, 30s and 40s. Not so much videos, but audio. And they are incredible to listen to, because the flute playing is not, like, the flute playing sounds like this. I kid you not. Now, let me put my original sound on. There we go. So if they were playing, let's say, Carmen, you know, the orchestral solo from Carmen, they'd have played it like this. It was just like the most wooden, unexpressive playing you have ever heard. There was no vibrato, there was no kind of color, there was no nothing. They just played these old wooden flutes and they just like hammered out all the notes. And that was the style of flute playing in the United Kingdom up till about the mid 40s. Now, in the mid 40s, something interesting happened. The world was coming out of World War II. Now, there was this guy, Geoffrey Gilbert. I'm sure many of you will have heard of Geoffrey Gilbert, many of you may not have. Geoffrey Gilbert was, at the time, the first flute in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, or the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, I forget which one. And he was playing in this British school of flute playing, wooden flute, no vibrato, no nothing. And he was booked by the BBC to play the Brandenburg Concertos live on the radio. So he started to practice the Brandenburg Concertos. And 1 week before the recording was to happen, he got a call or a letter from the orchestra manager saying, can you come to the office? So he went to the office and the orchestra manager said, hey, Geoffrey, I've got some bad news. You're not going to record these Brandenburg Concertos next week. The BBC has a new rule. All the flute players that are going to be playing on BBC have to be French from now on. And Geoffrey was like, what are you talking about? This is madness. Why is that? And the BBC guy said, well, it's just a new rule. You're welcome to come to the sessions and listen for yourself. So a week later, Geoffrey turned up at these recording sessions, and there was two flute players. If you know the Brandenburg Concertos, the flute appears twice in number 4 and number 5. In number 4, there's two of them, sometimes mostly played on recorder, but often nowadays on two flutes. And number 5 has one of them. The two flutes playing in number 4 was one guy called René Leroy. I can never say that name very well. René Leroy. And the other guy was Marcel Moyse. So Geoffrey sat there listening to these flute players play and was like, okay, I get it. I see why the BBC only wants French players to play. These guys are just phenomenal. And he had never heard anything like this. So afterwards, he went and knocked on the door of Marcel Moyse in the dressing room and said, hey, Mr. Moyse, could I take some lessons of you? My name's Geoffrey Gilbert. I'm the principal flute of the London Philharmonic. I'd really like some lessons. And Moyse said, no, it'd be too difficult. You already, know how to play the flute and you already have this style of flute playing. I don't want to do that. So being the good flute student that Geoffrey was, he then went and knocked on the door next door to René Leroy and said, hey, can I have flute lessons of you? And René Leroy said, yes, you can. So then the war broke out and Geoffrey Gilbert was assigned to serve his military service in one of the military bands, these musical band things. So he was posted kind of in the countryside with very little to do. So he would travel dangerously to France, I think once a month or something like this. And he would take these flute lessons with René Leroy. And then he would come back and he would kind of practice the French method and he would really relearn the embouchure and try and learn the singing style using vibrato and all this kind of stuff. And after all these years, the war ended. And Geoffrey went back to London and rejoined the orchestra. And he was pretty close to where he needed to be, but not quite perfect in terms of being able to play in this French style. And so the conductor of the orchestra was a guy called Thomas Beecham. Many of you will know of Thomas Beecham. And Gilbert told him what was going on. Beecham was very familiar with the French school. And he said to Geoffrey, look, you do what you need to do. If it's really dodgy playing for a couple of months, that's fine by me, because at the end of it, we'll have a style of flute playing that we really like. So Geoffrey persisted and became a real expert in the French school and was the first British player to really become a French player, if you like. And it became so popular, every other professional player in London in the kind of late 40s, early 50s was coming to take lessons of Geoffrey. And then not just London, but in England, and then into Scotland and Ireland and Wales and the whole of the United Kingdom. And then Europe were all coming to take lessons with Geoffrey Gilbert. So much so he actually left his job in the orchestra and took a teaching job at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and started teaching the French school. He was the first person in Britain to be playing a silver flute. He was playing a Louis Lot flute on the Boehm system rather than this wooden flute on an old system with no vibrato. Later on, so the French school became the most dominant school in the United Kingdom and Europe. Later on, in the 70s, I think it was, Geoffrey got fed up of the rain in London and the bad pay for musicians and moved to Florida and spent the last part of his career in the US at Stetson University, and was really one of the first to bring the French school of flute playing to America. There was a few others that came before him, people like Georges Barrère, but Geoffrey Gilbert is such an important figure in the French school of flute playing, even though he's not French. And that applies to the United Kingdom school and also the North American school. Marcel Moyse later on as well also moved to America and spent the last part of his life teaching out there as well. So the French school became dominant. Now, David Nicholson, going back to my teacher, had studied with Geoffrey at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and after graduating had gone to Paris on Geoffrey's advice to study with Rampal and Marcel Moyse. One of David's friends at the school at Guildhall while they were both studying together with Geoffrey Gilbert was a guy called James Galway, who was also a student there at the time. It's hard to think of him as a flute student, but he was a flute student at the time. So David and Sir James, not Sir at the time, Jimmy at the time, David and Jimmy were good pals, and they would go around London with him, and Webb was the third one. And they would all like take lessons off Geoffrey and go across to Paris and take lessons. So after Sir James, he actually was studying at a different school initially with a guy called John Francis, and left that teacher and went to Guildhall to study with Geoffrey, and then after that went to Paris to study. He was in the class of a guy called Gaston Crunel, but also took lessons off Rampal and Marcel Moïse as well. And then Sir James was one of my last kind of teacher, my final teacher as such. But then other people, I went to study with Peter Lloyd for a year. Peter Lloyd also studied at the Paris Conservatoire. He studied with Geoffrey Gilbert in the UK, and then Paris Conservatoire as well with a guy called Ferdinand Carriger. And just everyone I seemed to ever be taught by was French school. And I never really thought too much about it until leaving Europe. I didn't really realize how different I maybe played until I came to live in the US. Because for the last 18 months, I have lived here in Alabama. I left my orchestra job in 2012, I think it was, and I spent the next kind of almost 10 years just playing solo recitals, concertos, masterclasses, these kind of things. I had a small studio in Ireland that I saw once a month, but it was very small. There was only 5 of them. And I decided when COVID hit, I wanted to do other things and just kind of do some things I wanted to do. One of which was get my doctorate. I don't know why I wanted to do this, but I did. So I spent the last 18 months doing it, and I just finished on Monday, thank the Lord. So I'm now officially Dr. Stephen. Not that I will probably ever use that in my entire life because it sounds so ridiculous. But I found myself in the last 18 months here in America playing the flute in this very European way that some of them here in Alabama find quite funny at times. I was playing in the orchestra the other week, and we were playing Sousa, and the conductor said to me he'd never heard Sousa played so European in all his life. But it's been a really interesting process, and my doctoral research and dissertation was on the French School of Flute Playing, and in particular the competition pieces to do with the French School of Flute Playing, which is what we're supposed to be discussing here today, but none of the performers have actually turned up. So we'll definitely talk about some other things, but I was going to use them as an example. Although someone's already raised their hand. Is anyone waiting in the waiting room? No, Scott, what do you want to ask? I love how you're raising the hand. I feel like I'm a real professor when people raise
Right. I just didn't want to interrupt, so I was just waiting for a appropriate time. But are there books or is there anything out there that documents all of those stories that you just went through to talk about the influence of French music?
The best books you can read for this, I mean, I'd love to say I'm an expert, but I am not an expert. Even though I wrote a dissertation on it, like I'm a flute player who wrote a dissertation to get a DMA. I wouldn't say it's like the greatest piece of writing the world has ever seen. But books that I have read years ago and then actually came back to again over the last year are all the autobiographies. There's a biography of Marcel Moïse, which is really interesting. There's also an autobiography of Rampal. Sir James has about 27 different ones out, some of which are worth reading. He actually has a great book, which I read when I was a teenager, I think it's called like The Flute or something like this. And it's not actually anything to do with him. It's to do with flute playing. But there's so much of his career as part of this book, and it's a fantastic book. And it has lots of information about him taking his auditions for Berlin Phil and going to the Paris Conservatoire to study. But there's some really great books. Rampal wrote a book originally in French called Music My Love. I know it's published by Random House, and the reason I remember that is because I just was doing all the bibliography for my paper a week ago. But it's translated into English. If you can find it, it's not. When I was a teenager, I read it and had to go through all the secondhand bookstores to find it. Nowadays, I'm sure it exists online somewhere. Online didn't exist when I was a teenager, so it's worth reading. And the Rampal autobiography, I want to say it's by McCutcheon. Who's McCutcheon? Someone McCutcheon. It's not an autobiography, sorry, a biography by Rampal is a good one. There's also a book by Edward Blakeman on Taffanel called Genius of the Flute, which is a very good book. Actually, Blakeman has a few. Blakeman also has a book about the French School of Flute Playing. I forget what it's called, but they're all worth reading and kind of dipping in and out of. And I heard this amazing story, actually. Part of my paper, so as part of my DMA, this choice is here at the University of Alabama. We are going off on a tangent. Please tell me if I become very boring, but this is not what I was planning on doing. So there's options with your doctorate here at the University of Alabama. You can choose to write the full-blown 3 million word huge dissertation. I did not want to do that. The next option is to record like an album as such. You record this professional recording and then you write your paper, which is half the length of the original paper, but you write that paper based on the music you've recorded. I don't really want to do that either. I'm done with recording. I've done too much of that in the past and it just did not thrill me with something I wanted to do. But the other option was to give a couple of extra recitals. So everybody gives 3 recitals. I opted to do 5. And the 5th recital, I wrote about all the music. And that chopped my paper length in half. So that was a good option for me. So I decided to write about French repertoire, and I did this recital of all the French stuff and all concours, all examination pieces at the Paris Conservatoire, which we'll talk about. So it was things like, there was a de Merseman piece, which maybe isn't so well known, and then the Fauré Fantasy, the Gaubert Nocturne Allegro Scherzando, the Chaminade was in there, Jolivet Chantelinos was in there. So some of these big examination pieces. Oh, and the Louis Gann Andante and Scherzo. Do you all know this book? Yeah, so the Louis Gann is in here. I love the Louis Gann, and I used to play it a lot in my younger days, and then hadn't played it for some time. So I pulled it out for this exam. And when I was writing this paper, I had to research all the composers and the pieces, and I could find very little about Louis Gann. Like nothing, really nothing. What I learned was he was a bit like the French Sousa, actually. He wrote tons of like marches and all these kind of like wind band things. And so in France, around the late 1800s, he was quite well known, but now he's kind of not really known. A few operettas and things like that he wrote, but nothing major, apart from this one piece, the Andante and Scherzo, which is kind of still part of the flute repertoire, but no one really knows about it other than flute players. So I was doing some research and I was thinking, what on earth am I going to find to write about Louis Gann? How am I going to write 2,000 words on Louis Gann? This is going to be a problem. And I was just one day flicking through this Marcel Moïse biography, and I saw one sentence which changed my entire chapter on Louis Gann. And it was something along the lines of that Marcel Moïse had been inspired as a teenager to really become a professional flute player because he had loved watching Louis Gann's operetta, Le Soltambique or something. That was the one sentence, so I thought, amazing, in the Louis Gann chapter I can talk about Moïse, and then could write millions of words about Marcel Moïse. So that really saved my butt, so to speak, because I was struggling a bit with Louis Gann. So everything is very, very intertwined. So I guess the reason I'm telling you all this is because I really believe that even to this day, there is a very strong style in the French school of flute playing. And it's a style that we should try and exploit, not just in our French pieces, but in our playing in general. And there's lots of reasons as to why this style exists. And if these players are not going to turn up, I'd love to tell you about them. And then I'll show you how I kind of practice these things. The first thing was this flute that we play on nowadays, which really has relatively unchanged over the last 150 years or so, was not like this in the middle 1800s. In the middle 1800s, it was always made of wood. It was far fewer keys and buttons on it, and it was a different system of keywork. The combination of fingers that we use are very, very different. Also, the size of the tone holes, the holes that were bored into the flute were far smaller, far smaller, and the embouchure hole is far smaller as well. In the last 2 decades, these have got bigger because we want louder and louder sound. Now, the reality is, I see a lot of stuff on Flute Forum. I don't know if you read Flute Forum. I kind of love Flute Forum. I never ever want to comment on Flute Forum in my life and risk of being shot down and having my career ended, but I do quite enjoy reading it. And someone recently was comparing all these embouchure cuts and saying, isn't it a disgrace that flute makers are getting bigger and bigger and bigger? And of course, so many people are agreeing with him. I actually sat and thought, what a load of rubbish. The concert hall size has changed so much over the last 50 years. We need more volume. This is nothing to do with skill or technique. It's actually about practicality of working. And the same can be implied in the middle 1800s. There was no such thing as a flute recital in 1840 or 1850. It really didn't exist. Boehm kind of did it, and Charles Nicholson kind of did it, but the way we think of the flute now is very, very different. When a recital did happen, it was most likely to be in a very small room, kind of like a private home, these kind of salon-style concerts, and through even the entire Baroque era, the concept of the flute concerto and the flute recital was a very, very different thing from what it is nowadays. What kind of happened, Boehm, who was German and living in Munich, he was a good flute player on the old system, but he found things difficult because there was no keys on the flute, as I say. So essentially, and I'm really simplifying, holes were drilled into the tube. Now, for the flute to be in tune, these holes have to be in a very, very specific place. But it's impossible, literally impossible for the human hand to make the stretch to cover those holes. So what flute makers were having to do at the time was compromise on the intonation, the tuning system of the flute, and putting these holes in a more manageable location so that the human hand could cover it. Now, if you play a Baroque flute, the stretch is still pretty huge, and that's the compromised position. So it's a real challenge. What they also tried to do was make the tube a conical bore, so it kind of narrowed. It's fatter at one end than the other, and by making it narrower, you could put the holes slightly together. But it really was not very successful, and it's worth going and holding a Baroque flute, and you will see what I mean. It's very uncomfortable, but it meant that the flute was not played well. And it was a very, very difficult instrument to play, and it was quiet, and it was very light, and its qualities of that instrument lent itself to a very different kind of music to what we would play nowadays. So Boehm came along, and he invented pretty much this. He still was making flutes out of wood, but the keys were made of metal. But because he had this kind of lever system where you press one key and other keys go down, you can see that on the flute, it meant that he could position the holes where he wanted to, rather than where the human hand could stretch to. Those things were covered. And so overnight, I mean, it wasn't an overnight process, but pretty much overnight, the scale on the flute improved. And that meant that the fingering system changed, and that meant that all these technical showpieces could be played far better than ever before. So you got all these composers like de Meursaman and Toulouse who were writing all these pieces. And if you've never heard the de Meursaman solo de concerts, there's tons of them, or the Toulouse pieces, they're just fireworks. It's just like a ridiculous number of notes and very little musical substance. And this is kind of what was going on. Now, Boehm actually sold his design because when he invented this flute, nobody was very interested because nobody could be bothered relearning how to play the flute. And the one person who was interested was a guy called Claire Godefroy, who was the flute maker in Paris. And his son-in-law was a guy called Louis Lott. So they had gone into business together and were making flutes. And they actually purchased the patent for the Boehm flute. So at the time, they were the only ones that were making this system. Although he was German, this was in Paris. Now, Toulouse, this guy Toulouse who wrote these pieces, he was the professor of flute at the Paris Conservatoire. But he was very resistant to change. He did not want to play these flutes. He wanted to play the older system flutes. And so this meant that there was not really a huge amount of change at the time in Paris. However, then Toulouse retired, and he was replaced by a guy called Louis Doris. Louis Doris was a huge fan of these flutes, so made the Boehm system flute the official flute of the Paris Conservatoire. Now, the Paris Conservatoire to this day is still regarded as one of the best music schools in the world, especially for wind playing. So it was already producing great flute players. But in the late 1850s, early 1900s, it really started to produce the best players because Doris moved to the Boehm system. These people were playing louder. They were now silver flutes. They were playing faster, more accurate, and most importantly, the tuning system was better, and they could start to experiment with color. Now, after Doris, he was replaced at the Conservatoire by a guy called Paul Taffanel. Taffanel was hugely inspired by singing, and so introduced this kind of gentle vibrato sound. So in the space of about 2 or 3 decades, we went from this really wooden, ugly, kind of non-interesting playing. I hope there's no period performers here that are going to give me a hard time for saying that. But to this like beautiful singing expressive sound, and composers started to write for the flute in a completely different way. They moved away from all these like hugely virtuosic firework pieces to music that was far more powerful emotionally. Even the chaminade, we all laugh about the chaminade, but it's based on this beautiful melody that is about touching someone's heart rather than just playing the fireworks. Now, of course, the fireworks still exist, and that comes down to the Paris Conservatoire because they had a very interesting examination process, which has pretty much still stayed in place. It changed slightly in 2019 because of the COVID situation and what they say is a lack of funding, but I'm not quite sure how that works. But essentially what would happen is the students would go, and on their 3rd and final year of study, because of course it wasn't like you got a bachelor's of music at the time. Now at the Paris Conservatoire, they have slightly altered it so their degrees are a bit more in line with the rest of the world, but that didn't happen until the early 2000s. So at the time you would go and you would try and get your diploma, and you would have to do 2 things at the end of your 3rd year. You would have to play one standard piece, like a Mozart concerti or something like that, and then a newly commissioned piece, which we call the concours. the competition piece. Concours just means competition in French. And this is where every single French piece we practically play comes from. The Chaminade Concertino, the Fauré Fantasy, the Louis Gann and Dantean Scherzo, the Gobert Nocturne and Allegro Scherzando, the Ionesco, the Gobert Fantasy, the Taffanel Pastorale and Dante Scherzino, whatever it's called, the Dutilleux Sonatine, Chant de Linos, Le Merle Noir. All of these pieces, they were all written as examination pieces for the flute student at the Paris Conservatoire. So that meant they were being tested on two things. One, their technique, and that's why all of these pieces have technical challenges in them. But most importantly, their ability to communicate the message of music and to play with expression and to explore color and sound and vibrato and all these things. So for me, that is the essence of the French flute school. That whenever we play any of this music, our technique has to be so secure and fundamental and reliable that it allows us to completely play every piece with the emotional and the sound perspective at the forefront. And that is essentially what my entire dissertation was about. But that is a really important thing, because if we are going to play the Fauré Fantasy, for example, sometimes we never think about its actual purpose of existence. Sure, we probably know it was an examination piece, but why was it an examination piece? And what was the benefit or the purpose? The other thing too that's kind of interesting about the Fauré Fantasy is it was the first time in the concours history, the competition history, that the piece had been composed by a non-flute player. Up to that point, it was always a flute player or the professor that wrote it. But in 1908, I think it was, the Fauré Fantasy was written for the examination piece with the purpose of being the examination piece, and Fauré was not a flute player. He was the director of the Paris Conservatoire, but he was not the flute teacher. And that was an important point, because that changed from that point onwards how these commissions happened. Jill, you're going to say something. You need to unmute yourself, Jill. 3 years of Zoom.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. I want to let you know that I have two comments about what you said. One is, my understanding is that the flute professor at the time would pick the composer to write the concours piece, and that usually he would find something that he wanted to incorporate with the composer that maybe gave his students trouble. And if you go through that French composer's book, you can say, oh, this one's counting. Oh, this one's putting in five. Oh, this is articulation. Oh, this is whatever. And you can see exactly where the development of flute playing developed in France, I think, by looking at that book and saying, why did the flute professor at the time ask this composer to put these kinds of elements in that piece? And I think it was more as a challenge, because my understanding is that everyone got the music 2 weeks before the competition.
It was 1 month. You got it 1 month.
1 month. Okay, it was 1 month, and then it had to be done publicly. And that my understanding also was that they only awarded one first prize, and then you could graduate. And I believe Ron Paul did it his first year. And then you were allowed, if you had a second prize, you were allowed to come back and try again.
That's
and
correct.
then after a certain number of years, you had to leave. But I have one more comment since I'm on. I'm surprised that you found such a difference in flute playing when you went to Alabama. And I have to tell you, I'm old enough to be close enough to closer of the sources. And I have to tell you, I mean, I went to school in Boston. It was a straight George Laurent line, the French line. And of course, Moïse was very close to Boston as far as location. So a lot of people went up there. But I also grew up outside Philadelphia, which was the Kincaid School. Mm-hmm. And so that a lot of those people, as you're close to the sources, it's almost like playing the telephone game. The farther away you get from the source, the more that influence spread out through the US. And I think unless people went to study in Europe or abroad, I think a lot of the American playing is diluted a little bit according to where you are. Yeah. And so I think that's why I think your playing might have been a surprise down south. Perhaps not to the flute instructor, but to some of the students for exposure. But I think it's brilliant that you're going to be here. And I think it's brilliant you're going to be in the South. You're going to change the Southern playing down there.
I agree with everything you said. And this is important. The diluting of the style is definitely here now. Because when I was a teenager, I'm 39. So when I was doing my undergrad, which wasn't that long ago, I mean, it feels like a long time ago. But YouTube wasn't a thing. So if I wanted to hear a flute player in Russia, for example, I had to go to Russia, or they had to come to me. Now my students can jump online and hear anybody anywhere. And yeah, it's not the same being online, but we can get a real essence. So there is much more of a global style than ever before. However, I think something that comes into this quite strongly is accent. Definitely accent. And the way we speak and the way our voice shapes words, and our tongue is involved in this, of course, does affect the sound. So the British school of French playing will never be exactly like the French school of flute French playing, and the American school of French playing will never be like the British school of French playing, or the, you know, it all comes into it. So we have to find our own way. What Jill was saying about the going through the pieces and looking at certain techniques. Actually, I had a whole chapter on this, and I agree with her 100%. And I'm about to do something that I've never done before, and this class is turning into something that I was not expecting, and this is going to be a huge moment in my life. So please just go with it. I'm about to quote my paper for the very first time because I actually have a quote which is amazing. Because when the Forey Fancy was written, I didn't know this. Forey actually wrote it and then gave it to Taffanel, who was the teacher at the time, and said, I wrote this piece. You can change it whatever way you like and make it more of a competition piece. And Taffanel did. He actually took the Forey Fancy and made tons of alterations to it. And the Forey Fancy that we know now is really by Forey and Taffanel. But I did not know that. The extent that Taffanel changed it, we have no indication. All we do is have a little letter which Taffanel wrote to Forey, or was it Forey that wrote to Taffanel? Hang on, let me read. I don't think I'm looking. Oh no, I'm talking about a completely different piece. But this did happen with the Forey Fancy. Taffanel changed the Forey Fancy, and I have this whole chapter on it. We just don't know how much he changed. But jump about 30 years, 40 years earlier. No, not even that long. 15 years earlier. Anderson, Joachim Anderson. You know the Anderson that wrote the studies? He was asked to write the conservatoire examinations. Now, he did not teach at the conservatoire, but he was a flute player, which is why Forey was the first non-flute player to do it. Anderson, I don't know if you are aware of this, was the very, very first principal flute of the Berlin Philharmonic. And then who succeeded him? People like James Galway, who studied in France. People like Emmanuel Pahud, who studied in France. The French flute skill is very much alive and kicking. Anyway, Taffanel wrote a letter to Anderson when he asked him to write the piece, because before that point the flute professors had always written the piece. Anderson was still a flute player but was not the professor. And there's a great little quote that's in my paper, if I say so myself. This is what Taffanel wrote to Anderson. The piece should be short, 5 or 6 minutes at most. I will leave the form of it entirely up to you, whether an andante followed by an allegro or a single movement, but it needs to contain the wherewithal to test the examinees on matters of phrasing, expression, tone, color, and virtuosity. The accompaniment should be for piano. Isn't that amazing? Because every piece we have is exactly in that vein. So it's kind of an incredible thing. But all of this, the development of the flute, the development of the style of playing the new flute, and then the music of the day was what influenced what we now regard as the French flute school. This was not just a random school of flute playing that came out of France. It was very much engineered to be that school of flute playing. And then we, as British people and people from Canada and the US, I think everyone's from Canada and the US, I'm not sure, I apologize if you're not. The reason we play in this way is because this style then became the norm for us. I mean, there is, as I say, still differences, definite differences. For me, the American school is usually incredibly technical. Like they can really these young players can get around so much. But the vibrato is quite different to what the European vibrato might be. And that just comes down to personal taste. But it's really interesting for me as a player, and I hope for you guys as flute players to think, where does this come from and why are we playing like this? And then to approach these pieces, the Chaminade, the Forey Fancy, the Gobert, the Taffanel, the Ionesco, any of these things, with that in mind, changes my approach. It really changes my approach because even when I'm finding something technical and difficult, like for example, the little bit in the Forey Fantasy towards the end, we've still got to find the music in that. We've still got to find the music in that. And if you go listen to, in my opinion, the greatest French trained players in the world, from even, the Moyes right through to the Galways to the Pahuds and the younger generation now, the reason that they're competition winners and the reason that they win the Berlin Philharmonic editions and such things is because they have incredible technique, that they are trained in the French system of Taffanel, Gobert, Marcel, Moyes, but more importantly, the music comes first. The music absolutely comes first in everything that they do. So if it's one thing we're going to take away from this class, That's it. Whatever we do, the technique serves the music and not the other way around. And that applies to practicing technical exercises as well as pieces. So when you're practicing your Tafnel and Gobert scales, they absolutely must sound beautiful, and they must sound expressive, and they must have passion and shape. Because if you get accustomed to playing these things without that, you just get accustomed to playing without that. And every note that you play in your technical practice can be transplanted into your real flute playing as such, with the same expressiveness. So that is all I have to say on the matter of that. That took a long time to get there, but it's a really interesting story, and I really do recommend you go read these books. If you really want a snapshot, you can read my paper when it gets published on the ProQuest website. ProQuest is the dissertation website. Very boring. I mean, it really is dull, but you're welcome to go read that if you want. And it's kind of a snapshot of what we've just spoken about. I would far recommend that you go read, you know, the book about Rampal or Marcel Moyes or Tafnel. They are far more interestingly written and far probably more approachable than my horrendously dull paper. Don't tell my professors I said that, but it even put me to sleep at times when I was writing that thing. So if anyone has trouble sleeping, I have a good solution. But it's an interesting subject and an interesting topic. And so when we're practicing, for example, sonority exercise by Marcel Moyes, they can be boring. But if we can approach them with the thought of, actually, this is to be expressive, not just a nice, clear, focused sound, but actually expressive, then it becomes interesting, I think. And then it becomes something that I can bear to do mostly and just with kind of success and make progress with. So none of my players turned up, which is not the first time that's happened. We have 15 minutes left, 20 minutes left. We can have a chat. We can talk about things further. You can ask some questions, or I can ask you some questions. Or if somebody wants to play anything, now's the perfect time to do that as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be French, but you don't have to. We can continue our discussion if you like. I know Flute World do lots of these different classes with all these different people in, what do they call it? The collective. And most of them are discussion based. I very much try and keep mine playing based, so we're actually playing. But today is a different thing. So it's up to you guys. It's your time. Jill and Judy. Let's go with Jill first.
Okay. My question to you is, do you know which Anderson pieces were written as Concord pieces?
It's funny you say that, Jill, because if I consult my dissertation and I go to Appendix 1, I have a complete list of every Paris Conservatoire examination piece from the very first year right through to the final year. And apart from that one, I don't think Anderson ever did another. Let me check. So in 1897, maybe my paper's not as bad as I thought. In 1897, oh no, he did more than one. Hang on, I lost my year. He did two. So in 1895, Anderson wrote a piece called Morceau de Concert. Do you know this piece? I never heard of it. But anyway, it's there. Morceau de Concert, that was the examination piece in 1895. And then in 1897, he wrote Second Solo de Concert. That's what it was called. So, I don't know. I'm sure they're on IMSLP or something like that. What's amazing about this list is, I mean, it is long. I don't know if you can see. Hang on. Can you see it? Like, it is long. It's like 4 or 5 pages long. And I would say the majority of these pieces I have never heard of, ever. And so initially when I decided to do this project, I wasn't going to do 5 pieces that you all knew. Because my program was De Merseman Solo Concert No. 6, which even if you don't know that by name, you'll know it by tune. It's just very famous. And it's just one of these fast kind of showy off pieces. Then I did Fauré Fantasy, Chaminade. I had to do Chaminade. I'm in America. I just felt it was part of my American experience. And then Gobert Nocturne, Allegro Scherzando, Louis Gann, and Jolivet Chandeliers. That was my hours recital. But at first I was going to do 5 pieces nobody knew. So I found some random ones. There was one from, let me find the name of it, because it just caught me by surprise when I saw the name. And that's why I chose it. It's called like Al-Kazaba or something. Where was it? There. A la Casbah, 1911 by Georges, whoever that was. Georges. So I got this piece, I found it. I think Flute World sell it and I bought it. What a dreadful piece of music. Like, it was really boring. I would never program this. And that was the problem. Some of these pieces were really not very good pieces of music. So sure, there are some that are fantastic, but the ones that we play the most of, there is a reason. there is a reason why. And it's a shame because the other problem I have with French music, and I didn't touch this in my dissertation, but I did touch it in a class I was giving yesterday or something. Everybody and their dog plays these pieces, and I mean that with no disrespect, but I turn up to do all these master classes and I'm hearing 12-year-old kids playing these things. And yeah, sure, they can play them, but this is usually what's missing. So these pieces have become a bit like the chaminade. Do you know what I mean? Like we can't really take them seriously, which is such a shame because it's some of the greatest repertoire we have and we should take them seriously. So I'm on a mission to kind of change how the flute community looks at these pieces because it's a shame that it's been kind of warped into being something it really wasn't intended to be. But some people are sending me messages and writing saying you want to read the paper. I mean, you're welcome to. I'm warning you. I am warning you. Don't come crying and tell me that it caused you to fall asleep at the wheel of your car because it's really boring. But it does get published. I put it up for free publication. So when you write a dissertation, there's this company called ProQuest. And that's who has to publish the dissertation for you to get your doctoral degree. So if you go to proquest.com, every dissertation that someone has given permission of is put up there. And I have given free permission. I mean, like, what is anyone going to do with this? I have no idea. So once it gets approved by ProQuest, it'll pop up there. Yeah, that's it, ProQuest. Someone just spelled it. It's literally PROQUEST, ProQuest. I'd never heard of it either, but that's the company that deals with all the master's degrees and all the doctoral dissertations, I think, for America. So it'll probably appear by May. What happens now is I send it off to ProQuest and it's passed. You know, I went to my committee and we argue it. We go to this thing called the final defense. It's like going to court and you have to prove your research and everything. So I did that on Monday, almost a week ago. And I pass, and that's where you sign the paperwork to become doctor. And then you send it to ProQuest. So I upload it to ProQuest. They now go through it, or someone goes through it and checks for what they call formatting issues. You know, like this line isn't quite there, and that has to move there, blah, blah, blah. And then so they'll send it back to me to change those formatting issues, which I'm awaiting for. And once the formatting is changed, it then goes public on ProQuest. So Scott has just written something. Scott, pipe in, go on, tell me what you said. You know loads about this.
Yeah, so ProQuest is the company. The database itself is actually just called ProQuest Theses and Dissertations. So I just put that if somebody's trying to like Google it, you just put in like ProQuest Theses and Dissertations. It'll take you to their website to find it.
I'll make sure people know. I mean, it's very boring. So my dissertation has 5 chapters, I think. The first one is a history of the Paris. I can't believe I'm telling you this. The first one has a history of the Paris Conservatoire, like how it originated and how the examination process came. You know, like just the little quote I just read there a second ago. The second chapter is all about the development of the flute across the time and how that not interfered, what's the word, influenced the development of the repertoire for the Paris Conservatoire ones. The third one is kind of like program notes on the pieces that I played, essentially, like the bit about Marcel Moïse, listening to Louis Gann's opera and all this stuff. The fourth one is is a really stupid chapter in a way. It's what I call technical analysis, but it's basically like where I take the very fancy and say this bit's hard for double tonguing and this bit's hard for this and this bit's hard for that. And then the fifth one is like, what about now? What about the modern Paris Conservatoire? And essentially in the last few years they haven't done it because they ran out of money for commissions, is what they're saying publicly. I don't know if that's true or not. So now they've gone back to repeating a lot of the pieces from the past, and also still you have to do more than just your Mozart concerto. Like orchestral excerpts appear in there now and things, so it's become a bit more of a modern process, but the concept is the same and the jury kind of system is the same. And then at the end there's 2 appendixes, one that has a complete list of every piece from the very first right through to the last one, which was 2019, and then another list which was every Paris Conservatoire flute professor that there has been as well. Which is kind of an interesting list because loads of these people you'll know and you'll never have realized they were Paris Conservatoire flute professors. The very first Conservatoire flute professor who got the job in 1795 was Devienne. Who knew that Francois Devienne, the guy that writes all the trios? And then there's a few you'll never have heard of. I need to look at my paper for this. Jacques Schneitzenhofer. He was there for 7 years. And then Antoine Hugo, but there's a few, like Louis Doris, Taffnel, Altes, Philippe Gobert, Marcel Moïse, Gaston Crunel, Jean-Pierre Rampal was there for ages, Marion Debauched, and then now there's 3. For the first time we have more than 1. And there's Pierre-Yves Artaud, Vincent Lucas, and Sophie Cherry are all professors. So it's a kind of, this bit's interesting, the bit before it is really not interesting. But this is amazing music, and I think, as I say, we need to owe it the respect it deserves. It shouldn't be there just for like showing off. It should be there to actually show our instrument off, but connect with listeners on a quite a deep level. You know, there's a great story about Chaminade. Do you know the story of Chaminade? She has a really interesting story. Does everyone know the Chaminade concertino? Yeah, of course everyone does. I mean, it's a great piece. I don't know why everyone in this country laughs about it. We don't have the same kind of opinion towards it in Europe that maybe the American system does. But Chaminade was very talented as a young girl, like super, super talented, and was getting a lot of attention. And when she was like 16 or 15 or something really young, maybe even younger, she got accepted into the Paris Conservatoire to study composition and piano. But her dad wouldn't let her go because he didn't think it was very becoming of a girl to go to study at an institution like that. So he was quite wealthy. So he actually hired all the teachers from the conservatoire to teach her privately. So they would all come to her house. And she got this amazing education, but she was never really taken that seriously in Paris because she hadn't gone to like the old boys club, so to speak. And also, she was a girl, you know, she was a woman, and women were just sadly not taken seriously. So she really suffered from that point of view, but she had some success. She went on tour to the UK, she went on tour to the US. That's the official story. The unofficial story is, and I really don't know if this is true. I'm sure some of you may have heard this before. Jill, you might know a little bit about this more than me, but apparently Taffanel was madly, madly in love. Sorry, Chaminade was madly in love with Taffanel, and he was not in love with her. So I don't know if this is true. This does not make it into the paper because I genuinely don't know if this is true. But when he said to her, "Hey, Cecile, probably not Chaminade. Hey, Cecile, can you write the examination piece?" So she was commissioned to do it. So she started to write the most beautiful love tune in the world. It was a love letter in music to Taffanel. And then she heard, just a short time later, he was getting married to someone else. So she hadn't finished the piece, but she went to Taffanel and she went, "Paul, I really love you. Don't marry this other girl. Marry me. I wrote you this beautiful piece to show you my love." And he played it and he was like, "Wow, this is really beautiful. But I'm not going to marry you. I'm going to marry this other woman instead." So Taffanel was heartbroken. So she went back and wrote the second half and made it just the most fiendishly difficult thing you've ever heard of. That's the unofficial story. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard this story over and over again. And there's a very funny little book. It's hard to find much information about Chaminade, but there's a terribly Mills and Boon style book all about Chaminade called Scarf Dance, which I found eventually and read, and it's very skinny and it's worth reading because it's quite funny and it tells you all about her as a child and things like that. It doesn't really mention that story again, so it could be a complete load of rubbish. But you know, this is a great piece of music that was built on emotion and sentiment. And as a society of flute players, we've mostly destroyed that, you know, partly through the story that I'm telling you, but because everybody plays this piece. All these little children are playing this piece that's actually fiendishly difficult. I mean, that Chaminade piece is horrendously difficult to play. That cadenza, I find very, very demanding. So it's kind of a shame. Scott, your hand has been up a while. What would you like to say?
No worries. I just had a question. So where or how did things change? So if you look at like the Foray Morceau de Concours piece, which is like a very simple one-page piece,
Well,
to the other pieces, like where was that? How did that shift change, or what was that between something not so difficult to more difficult?
it's a good question. First of all, the Morceau de Concours was not written as a Paris Conservatoire examination piece. It was written as a sight reading examination. The
Okay.
story goes, Fauré was the director of the conservatoire at the time, which is like the dean, you know, the dean of the school. But he didn't live in Paris, he lived in the countryside. And he got up one morning and he went into school, he went into work. And he was walking through the streets of Paris and he was like, "Where is everybody? There's nobody here." And he got to his office and there was no, his secretary wasn't there, no one was in. And he was like, "Damn, it's Bastille Day." He totally forgot that it was Bastille Day. So he couldn't be bothered walking all the way back and having to get the train home. So he just sat and did some work and he scribbled out this little melody, "Yambody, and then added a repeat sign, literally just added a repeat sign. And that became the examination, the sight reading exam for the conservatoire. It was never written as a flute concours piece. So that's a completely different thing altogether. But we just kind of add this repeat sign, double the length, and play it as a beautiful tune. But you know, I will argue that this is a much harder piece than people treat it as. If you're going to play that piece 40 with no sense of style, color, or control, sure, it's easy. But if you're going to actually play what's written on the page with the piano diminuendo ending up to the top F and really control the color and really think about intonation and expression, then it's incredibly difficult. I argue the same about the Poulenc Sonata. I do not play the Poulenc Sonata in public. I will not do it. Not because I find it a bad piece, but because I do not think I can do the second movement well enough. First movement's fine, third movement's fine. That second movement, if I'm going to play it, I'm sorry if this sounds offensive, I really don't mean it to be offensive, but I'm going to say it anyway. If I'm going to play it average like everybody, I'll do it. But I don't want to do that. I want to do it better than that. And I can't do it yet to the level that I think it deserves to really control those dynamics and really control the color and have that flexibility and control of sound. So I haven't, it is not in my repertoire. When I was playing full time, which was what, like 150 concerts a year for a decade, I never played it once. Never played it once. I played it privately and I played it at college and stuff when I was an undergrad, but I've never played it in a real concert. And I will probably never play it in a real concert because, no, maybe I will one day. But you know, the same with the Bach Partita. When I was an undergrad, I really wanted to play the Bach Partita because it doesn't seem that hard. You know what I mean? Anyone can play the notes. And my teacher said, David Nixon said, no, you're not ready for Bach Partita. So I never played it. And then I went to do my artist diploma with Peter Lloyd. And I said, Peter, I really want to play the Bach Partita. And he said, oh, no, you're not ready for the Bach Partita. And then I took lessons off Sir James, and I said to him one day in London, I was having a lesson with him, I said, hey, I really want to play the Bach Partita. And he went, oh, no, I don't think you should do that. And so I got to like 35, I'd never played the Bach Partita. And then COVID hit, and everything was cancelled except for unaccompanied recitals, and I needed hours upon hours of unaccompanied recitals. So the first time I ever played the Bach Partita was in a recording for Naxos. And I still laugh about this, that, you know, I just never played it in public. Now I played it like maybe 7 or 8 times. But, you know, I get in my head about things are hard and I don't want to do things that I don't think I do well enough. And I feel very much like that about the Poulenc Sonata and about a lot of this French stuff. The Chaminade is a perfect example. Everybody bangs through this piece, but go listen to like someone incredible play it and it's a different piece altogether. Chantelinos, that's a different thing. That's hard. That's very, very difficult.
Who would you suggest to listen to for something? Like, who would you recommend?
You know who my absolute favorite Chaminade in the world is, and I'm sorry to say it because I know you'll all really right, is James Galway. Go and listen to his Chaminade. It's spectacular. The way he changes the color and the fast movement in particular. The other recording I like very much is Manuela Wiesler, or Weisler, I'm not quite sure how you say it. She was a fantastic player. She sadly died of breast cancer far too young. And she has some great recordings, some of which I don't love as much as everybody else loves. She actually was a student of Galway's, though, unfortunately, so it's still within the same thing. I'm a huge Emmanuel Pahud fan. I'm actually going to study with him for a little bit this summer, just because I don't want to like retire having not learned from all these fantastic people. And I love Emmanuel's playing, but I hate the way he plays the Chaminade. I hate it. I'm sorry to dismiss other people's playing, because it kind of lacks. It's kind of overplayed in a way, but other people love it. And you know, it doesn't matter who I love at the end of the day. It matters who plays it and touches your heart. If you want to listen to the most incredible Poulenc ever, Pahud's version is fantastic. But actually, my favorite version of Poulenc is Jacques Zohn, who I had some lessons with when I was younger. Jacques is a Dutch player. He, for many years, was in the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra and then the Boston Symphony. When I was a teenager and in my undergrad, he was just leaving the Boston Symphony. He now teaches in Spain and you don't hear from him so much, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, he was a superstar and is just the most incredible player. Builds his own flute, which is an amazing thing. But if I don't know how available his recordings are, but he recorded all the French stuff, and his recording of Poulenc is just, that last note of the second movement is just insane. As is Emmanuel's. I mean, Emmanuel's Chantelinos, like, it is the most accurate version. I was supposed to play Chantelinos for my very first time at the Wisconsin Flute Festival. I was the guest artist there a while ago, and it went virtual. So we were like, shall we change the program? And then Ashley, who plays piano with me, we decided, no, it's virtual. This is the perfect time to play Chantelinos because you could record it, so you don't have to like worry about it going wrong. You can do it again. But then he hurt a tendon in his hand or something like that and couldn't play for a month, so we had to change the program because it's very demanding for piano as well. He then flew over here to play a bunch of concerts with me, and we did it in my DMA recital, my 5th DMA recital. And that was the first time I'd ever played Chantelinos in front of an audience. And I really enjoyed it, actually. I was really proud of our recording of it. But I don't think it's probably possible, if I'm to be really honest, to play the entire piece flawless. Like, of course, it's live music, but to get every single note and every single rhythm and every single low note without splitting a single thing, I'm not sure if it's 100% possible. And I actually read a quote from Patrick Galois, another great French player, who said, I don't think it's possible. I mean, you can do it, get close, but it's not quite possible. Go and listen to Pahud's recording. I mean, I'd love to know if it, I can kind of hear the patching sometimes just from years of having to do it, you know, where people are changing things. But I think it's done in one go, and it's just incredible. So not Jacques Zone, sorry, it's my funny accent. I'll write how I spell it. It's actually spelled Zune, but pronounced Zone. Jacques Zune. But he always pronounces it Zone, so I just say the same. Oh, why have I got rid of that chat? So there's a lot of French playing. Do you know the other recording I love of the Louis Gann is a recording by Tim Hutchins, who is the principal flute of the Montreal Symphony, studied with Geoffrey Gilbert. I don't know if he studied in France. He might have done. It wouldn't shock me if he did. Maybe took lessons with Moyse and stuff. He's got a great recording of a lot of French repertoire, but his Louis Gann is phenomenal. It's probably on Spotify or something. Jill.
I have like 3 questions for you.
Okay, I'll do best.
All right. One would be, over in the States, a lot of the pieces from that French composer's book are in competition for these young kids. So they have to learn them. And the problem comes is I think that because the technical standard has gotten so good so early over here, and yes, maybe they're not mature enough to play it. I think that I find that they just have to revisit it when they get to a better teacher and they get older. But unfortunately, some of these pieces that the kids are asked to play are musically are too advanced for them, for their technical level. And yet in the States, we're sort of forced to teach these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
That's my first comment. The second one would be, in your exploration of the Paris Conservatory pieces, did you happen to find any that you thought nobody really knows these and these are really fantastic, and that you might incorporate back into your repertoire? That's one of the other questions. And the other one would be, is your recital are we able to see that somewhere if we didn't watch it live?
There's a couple are on YouTube, like Chandelinos, I think, is up there now. Gobert Nocturne, Allegro Scherzandos. I haven't done a huge amount of stuff like that recently just because of time. There's a few, I don't know if you're on Instagram, there's always loads of clips of it. In fact, I tend to put full pieces up on Instagram, so I think a lot of them are up there. But the only one I won't make public is Foray, because it went really well. It's one of the better. I played this piece a lot, like for when I was on tour a lot. It was always a piece we would program. And Ash and I didn't rehearse it at all. We sometimes do this, which is terrible to admit aloud. We played it probably, I kid you not, 300 times. Do you know, like, we're not going to rehearse 40 Fancy. We had one day to rehearse this entire program. He actually was supposed to come in a day early, and then his flight got delayed, which meant he missed the connection in Miami. So we had just the morning and afternoon of the recital to rehearse, because then the next day we were going elsewhere to play. And we were playing the 40 Fancy, and it was all going really well, and he just played one chord. That's completely incorrect. But it's like, it's kind of, I'm sitting at piano, so it's literally like, I don't know. You know, like, you know, like just one really bad one. So I just can't put it up because he would hate me forever for doing it. But I think everything else has been made available. I will eventually get Ryan and maybe make a thing of it, and I can put it on YouTube so you can watch the whole concert. As part of your DMA, you have a committee, like a committee of 6 people, and they're supposed to attend all your recitals, but they don't. In fact, I don't think a single one came to any of mine, which is fine. So they're supposed to be live streamed, and then they can watch online, and then they grade your recitals. But of course, no one fails these things, so they don't watch them. But I did not want mine live streamed because I'm in a unique situation, not completely unique, but relatively rare situation where, yes, I came back to do my DMA having had a fairly substantial career, and I was still continuing to work. And there were people that were paying me money to come play concerts, and I did not want them seeing that I had given it the night before for free as part of my degree. Do you know, I thought that was disrespectful. So I asked the university not to stream my recitals. So instead they recorded them. So I actually have amazing recordings of everything because they brought in the cameras and everything. And one day I will work through them all and do it. I'm not really one for recording live concerts. I don't really enjoy it. And once we kind of came out at the end of COVID, hopefully we'll stay there. I really started to say no to live streaming and no to recording because I just wanted to enjoy live music again. And the people that had paid the money and made the effort to come there I got that full experience. I appreciate the one great thing of Code was we could see concerts from all over the world and kind of get involved in the live streaming. But I think we went a little too far at some point where it became the norm. And as a musician, it's just one extra thing to worry about because things happen. You know, things happen in real life. And I wanted to be able to let things happen without me worried that the entire planet had it saved on their hard drive. Do you know what I mean? So I'm really saying no to pretty much every live streaming that comes my way at the moment. And I know that frustrates some people, but it's just a deliberate thing for a while to do. But I do actually have these recorded because I said no to live streaming and then my committee had to record them. So sometime I will work through it, but there are some on YouTube already. I haven't answered any of your questions. There was some great pieces. This list, you know, it's hit or miss. What I did is there's several pieces, and I marked this all on the list. There are several pieces that were used more than once, and you get a little symbol for different things. Some of which you've never heard of. Let me find you one that you've never heard of. The Concertino in E major by Tomasi. Does anyone know that? I'd never heard of it. 1945, the year after Chandelinos. That was 1944. You know, that's a good piece. Alla Casbah, not such a good piece. There's some recordings of Alla Casbah though on YouTube. I found, I think it was like Alan Marion or someone playing it, and it's lovely playing. But I'm like, this is not an interesting piece. So it's hit or miss. It would be interesting to have flute music by French composers Volume 2. Which drummer would be interested? And here's the pieces that you don't know. Maybe I should write to them.
One more question. Do you know was the Go Bear Madrigal written as a sight reading piece? Do you know anything about that?
Sight reading, I'm not sure. Gobert was a really interesting guy because he studied with Taffanel, and Marcel Moïse studied with Gobert, by the way. So and then Galway and all these people studied with Marcel Moïse. So you know we think about this as a long time ago. This is not a long time ago. My great grandfather of flute playing is Paul Taffanel. It's really not a long time ago at all. But Gobert was an interesting guy because he was a great flute player. And he won he lived in this little regional town outside of Paris, and his mum was like a housekeeper. She used to clean the house, and one of her clients was Paul Taffanel, and that is how Taffanel found Gobert, because he was already playing the flute as a kid, and his mum went round to clean his house and took Philippe with him, and Taffanel heard him playing his flute and said, "You need to study with me." So started giving him lessons, and then when Taffanel got the job at the Paris Conservatoire, he took Gobert with him. He was only 14 years old. And he took him with him. And Gobert won the Premier Prix Award in 1 year. That's all it took. Then he went back and studied conducting at the Conservatoire and became a really famous conductor and also composition. In fact, Gobert won a thing called the Prix de Rome, which is like the #1 composing competition in the world still to this day. Later on, Gobert became the principal conductor of the Paris Opera, which at the time was like the Berlin Philharmonic, the orchestra. And then later after that, he became the managing director of the Paris Opera. So had this huge career, not just as a flute player. We think of him as this little flute player. No, he was like Beyonce of his day. You know, he was a really, really major guy. But I read this interesting thing about him practicing. I've known this story for years, and I don't know who told it to me. It could have been Galway, it could have been someone else. Probably Marcel Moïse told it to them. The story was Gobert he had a lot of things to do every day because he was a composer, a flute player, a conductor, a businessman. You know, he had a lot of things going on. And he didn't always have time to practice. So he would get out of bed every morning and he would pick out his flute, still in his pajamas, and he would play a top B flat pianissimo. And if it worked, he didn't practice that day. The days it didn't work, he would practice. Also, this Taffanel and Gobert scale book that we use, this was not written by Taffanel. This was written by Gobert and Louis Fleury, who was another student of Taffanel's. And Taffanel had taught these exercises to all his students, but once he died, Gobert and Louis Fleury made the book. Taffanel was not alive when Taffanel and Gobert came out. We just call it Taffanel and Gobert. But I mean, it's an incredible resource. So it's worth going through. I mean, I'm sure you won't be able to find a complete appendix online, I don't think, because I couldn't find one, but I found lots of chunks of one, so it's worth having a look. And just go through them and you'll be amazed at how many pieces you've never heard of. I mean, from 1832 to 1861, every single piece was written by Tulu. Every single one. It's like solo 1, solo 2, solo 3. So it really doesn't start to get interesting until the late 1800s. And that's when you'll start to see all the pieces that you're familiar with appearing. And some Colbert's pieces were used several times. Le Merle Noir has been used a couple of times as well by Messiaen. But a lot of them, Chaminade, for example, just the ones. But it's an interesting subject. This was not the class I was expecting. I'm so sorry, we're running to the end of time. We didn't play a single note. That was not what I was expecting. I have no idea why the flute players actually didn't turn up. Flute World need to vet this a little better. Thank you all for taking part in this very interesting discussion. I actually have quite enjoyed myself. I feel like such an academic. Maybe Dr. Stephen is actually gets involved. I really don't think he does. But anyway. Tulu, let me write this name for you. Some people are asking. Tulu.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was great. Enjoyed it
You're
very
welcome.
much.
But you know, like we should be kind of proud because whether you realize it or not, we are all flute players in the French tradition because it's the only tradition that really exists anymore. I mean, yeah, we have this globalization, and sure, there's still very much an Italian school where you can hear this definite style of playing, and a Russian school as well, and a British school, and an American school. British school is a bit kind of weak now, but the American school still exists, and that exists because of people like Baker and Tom Nyfinger and all these people. You know, they have a very, very unique sound. I love listening to all these recordings, and I cannot say the French school is the best. I absolutely prefer it. Of course I do. But it's what I'm used to and what I've aspired to be. But as long as you can justify why you like something, who cares what anyone else thinks? You know, we're dealing with music here. We're not dealing with heart surgery. No one's going to die. We just have to do something that moves us musically and emotionally. But I think this is why the French school to me is so interesting because we can really trace its history and trace its legacy and actually see a bigger purpose to its existence and why it evolved out of what we had before. So I encourage you to go read some books and play the music with a whole different set of eyes, ears, you know, just approaching it from a completely different place. And then maybe one day we'll have a flute music by French composers too. And then we can have a class on those pieces that nobody knows. But I'll leave you guys to it. Big thanks to Flute World. I know they'll watch this back, so thank you to them for sponsoring all these classes. I appreciate it. Please feel free to write to me. I'm on all the usual social media stuff. If you want to have a geeky conversation about French music, I love it. I'm in my element right now. I feel like so knowledgeable having done all this dissertation and research. I've got, I think, about 6 months of cleverness. Do you know what I mean? And then I'm going to lose it all. I'm at like 100% cleverness right now. So now's a good time to talk to me about it. But nice to see you guys. Have a great weekend. Happy
Yes.
practicing. See you all
Nice
later.
to see you, Stephen.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Bye.